She didn't say a word when they laughed at her rifle. She didn't say a word when they laughed at her rank. She just settled into position, controlled her breathing, and started hitting targets that men with $50,000 setups couldn't touch. But the moment that broke the entire range, the moment that made a decorated Navy SEAL set down his own weapon and walk it over to a woman everyone had already written off, that's the moment nobody saw coming. One shot, one target, over 2,000 meters of desert wind standing between her and silence. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever walked into a room and felt every eye decide you don't belong, this story is going to hit different. Subscribe to the channel, drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, and don't you dare look away. The convoy of pickup trucks arrived before dawn. By the time the Arizona sun had cleared the canyon rim and started cooking the rock, that particular brand of dry, merciless desert heat that turns asphalt soft by 9 in the morning, the Red Mesa Precision Center's main firing line was already crowded with men who moved like they owned the ground beneath their boots. They came from different commands, different branches, different war stories. Rangers from the 75th, Marine Raiders with sun-bleached gear and that quiet, controlled energy of men who'd spent too many nights in places that don't appear on public maps. Two Delta operators who arrived in a rental car with civilian plates and no unit patches, which told everyone on the line exactly who they were. And the SEALs. 4 of them from DevGrew's sniper cell, who set up their equipment with the practiced efficiency of surgeons and spoke to no one outside their own group unless spoken to first. The Iron Horizon Challenge happened once a year. It wasn't officially sanctioned by any branch. No promotion points, no medal, no ceremony beyond a brief handshake and a challenge coin that nobody outside the community would recognize. But inside the community, inside that tight, deliberately obscure world of military precision shooting, it was the only competition that actually mattered. Because Iron Horizon didn't care about your equipment budget. It didn't care about your sponsor, or your custom bolt, or the $3,000 your unit spent on your glass. It cared about one thing: whether you could hit the target. The targets this year were the same as every year. 7 steel plates positioned along the canyon's natural geography at distances that started uncomfortable and ended somewhere between ambitious and delusional. The first plate sat at 900 meters, barely a warm-up for this crowd. They stepped up: 1,100, 1,300, 1,500, 1,700. The 6th plate anchored itself at 1,900 meters, already past the practical engagement range of most military rifles under field conditions. And then there was the 7th, 2,240 meters. The range officer had paced it out himself that morning and double-checked the laser rangefinder twice because the number seemed wrong even when you were looking directly at the target. A 1-foot steel plate at 2,000 meters didn't look like a target. It looked like an optical illusion. It looked like a smudge on the canyon wall that your eyes kept wanting to reclassify as a shadow or a rock face imperfection. You could stare directly at it, and your brain would refuse to process it as something a bullet was supposed to find. Most of the men on the line had made their peace with the fact that number 7 was essentially theoretical. You shot at it because that was the exercise. But you planned your score around 6 clean hits and accepted that the final plate was the range's way of reminding you that humility is not optional. Gunnery Sergeant Logan Pierce had not made that peace. He was standing near the equipment tables when Evelyn Cross pulled into the parking area in a government pool Chevy Tahoe with a cracked windshield and a passenger seat covered in protein bar wrappers. Pierce noticed her the way you notice the wrong car at a car show, involuntarily, with a slight wince, followed by a second look to make sure you're seeing what you think you're seeing. She was in her mid-30s, medium height, lean, the way distance runners are lean rather than the way gym-built operators are lean, with the kind of economical muscle distribution that comes from years of carrying weight over terrain rather than lifting it in controlled conditions. Her uniform was standard issue, no special unit patches, no embellishments, nothing that communicated anything about where she'd been or what she'd done. She carried her rifle case the way most people carry a guitar, familiar, casual, comfortable, with the ease of something handled thousands of times over years. Pierce's rifle case cost $9,000. The case itself, not the rifle. "Hey, Sergeant," he called across the parking area, loud enough that the 3 rangers nearby looked up. "You lost?" Hunters Association meets on the South Range on weekends. One of the rangers actually laughed. Pierce smiled at his own joke with the satisfaction of a man who has never in his life wondered whether he was being funny or just being loud. Evelyn glanced at him, just glanced, the way you glance at a television playing in a waiting room when you're not interested in the program, but the sound is impossible to completely ignore. Then she looked away, picked up her equipment bag, and walked toward the check-in table. Pierce watched her go with the expression of someone waiting for a reaction that didn't come. "All right," he said to no one in particular. "All right." The check-in table was staffed by Master Sergeant Gerald Okafor, who had been running Iron Horizon's administrative side for 6 of its 9 years, and who had long since developed the particular expression of a man who has witnessed more bravado per square foot at this event than anywhere else on Earth. He processed competitors with brisk efficiency, asked for ID and unit verification, and handed each person a competitor card with their shooting order and assigned lane. Evelyn placed her military ID on the table. Okafor picked it up, looked at it, looked at her, and looked back at it with a barely perceptible pause before handing it back. Whatever the ID said, he filed it under none of my business and handed her a competitor card. "Lane 7, he said. "You're shooting mid-afternoon, weather window should be decent. Canyon usually gets a thermal shift around 1400 hours, crosswind goes variable, but you'll get 15 minutes of relative stability if you catch the right moment." "I know," Evelyn said. "I've shot this canyon before." Okafor looked at her again. "Have you?" "Twice. Lost both times." She picked up her card. "Different wind." She walked away. Okafor watched her go with the expression of a man filing information in the back of a mental cabinet labeled things to pay attention to later set. From the observation tower on the South Ridge, Lieutenant General Nathan Holloway watched the firing line through a pair of Steiner military binoculars that were older than half the competitors below him. He was technically present in an unofficial capacity. He told his aide he was taking personal leave. His aide, who had worked for him for 4 years, understood that personal leave in the general's vocabulary meant he was doing something he found more interesting than whatever the official schedule offered, and wisely did not push for details. Holloway tracked competitors through the binoculars with the practiced eye of a man who had spent 30 years evaluating human performance under pressure. He watched Pierce set up his equipment. The way Pierce moved told you things. Confident, organized, slightly theatrical. The way he handled his rifle said, "I know what I'm doing." The way he glanced around to see if anyone was watching said, "I want credit for knowing what I'm doing." There was a difference, and Holloway had learned to read it. Then he found Evelyn Cross. She was setting up quietly at lane 7, spreading her equipment on the shooting mat with what looked like a completely different energy. No performance, no checking peripherally for witnesses. She opened her notebook, actual paper, spiral-bound, the edges worn soft, and began writing observations that Holloway was too far away to read, but recognized by the rhythm. Wind conditions, mirage assessment, environmental data logged with the patience of someone who understood that the data mattered more than the impression. Her rifle lay across the mat. Standard military issue M2010 enhanced sniper rifle, a fine weapon, accurate, reliable, built to perform within its design parameters. But at this competition, surrounded by custom-built precision rifles with specialized chamberings and premium components, it looked like the generic version of the thing everyone else had brought the real version of. Holloway lowered his binoculars, raised them again. There was something about the way she moved. He'd seen it before. Not in many people. A handful in 30 years, maybe less. That quality of absolute internal stillness that some operators develop not through training, but through something that happened on the far side of enough real-world experience. A stillness that didn't read as relaxed, because relaxed implied the absence of tension. This was different. This was tension so thoroughly mastered that it had been converted into a resource rather than a liability. He wrote nothing in the small notebook he carried. He just watched. Chief Petty Officer Derek Hayes had been a sniper for 11 years, which meant he'd spent 11 years developing the habit of observing things other people weren't observing. This was not a skill you could turn off at the end of a deployment. It simply became the way you processed the world, the background running program that your brain kept executing regardless of whether you wanted it to. He noticed Evelyn Cross the moment she started preparing her shooting position. Not because of anything dramatic, not because of anything wrong. He noticed her because everything was right, and that was unusual. In his experience, most shooters, even very good shooters, even elite trained operators, had at least one tell. One habit. One small inefficiency that you could identify if you watched closely enough. The way they settled into position always had something, a slight adjustment after the initial setup, a recalibration of the natural point of aim, something that said the first attempt wasn't quite right. It was normal. It was human. Evelyn Cross set up once. Didn't adjust. Didn't recalibrate. Her position was simply correct the first time, the way a professional musician plays a chord. Without hesitation, without searching, without any visible process between intention and execution. He watched her run a small piece of thread, actually thread, the kind from a sewing kit, tied to a thin rod she'd planted at the edge of her mat, as a wind indicator. Around him, competitors were checking sophisticated Kestrel weather meters, running ballistic calculators on mounted tablets, cross-referencing atmospheric data with shooting apps that cost more per year in subscription fees than her rifle cost to maintain. Evelyn Cross was watching a piece of thread. Hayes stepped closer, positioning himself at the edge of her lane's boundary. He watched the thread. Then he watched her watch the thread. The way her eyes tracked the movement, the timing between observation and the notes she made. She wasn't just reading the wind, she was reading the pattern of the wind. The frequency of the shifts, the lag between the indicator movement and what it meant at distance. He'd done the same thing in places he couldn't name for reasons he still didn't think about in daylight. He stepped back before she noticed him looking. Pierce's gear was the talk of the line, which was precisely the effect Pierce had engineered. The rifle itself was a masterwork of custom fabrication. A 338 Lapua Magnum built on a surgeon action with a carbon fiber stock, a suppressor that had cost more than most people's cars, and an optic that Pierce described as the best glass in the Northern Hemisphere without any particular evidence for the geographic qualification. He'd shot it in 3 international competitions and placed in 2. His unit's armorer had fitted and adjusted it personally. His dope book, the ballistic data notebook every precision shooter maintained, was pristine, organized, and laminated. "You know what the wind's going to be like today?" he said to the ranger standing nearest to him, a quiet specialist named Torres, who had the look of someone waiting for permission to leave a conversation he hadn't chosen to enter. "Variable," Torres said. "Variable is the polite word," Pierce said. He was already angling toward Evelyn's lane, moving with the casual purposefulness of someone who has decided to make a point. "You see what our new competitor brought to a precision rifle match?" Torres looked at Evelyn's M2010, looked back at Pierce, said nothing. "Standard issue," Pierce said. "M2010, good rifle." He paused to let the good rifle land with the weight of damning praise. "For 2,000-meter plate? She might as well have brought a garden hose." Torres made a non-committal sound. "I'm just saying," Pierce continued, louder now, pitched to carry to adjacent lanes. "You've got to respect the enthusiasm. But there's a reason they make purpose-built precision rifles. Physics doesn't care about your feelings." Several competitors nearby heard this. A couple of them smiled. One, a ranger from a different unit, looked at the mat and said nothing, which was its own kind of vote. Evelyn was 10 feet away. She had heard every word. Her pen moved across her notebook without pausing. Her eyes stayed on the thread. Her breathing stayed steady. Pierce watched her for a moment, waiting for something. A reaction, a flicker, anything. He got nothing. "All right," he said again, to no one in particular. He said it the exact same way he'd said it in the parking lot, and it landed the exact same way, with the sound of a man who has mistaken volume for authority and is surprised when the world disagrees. The competition began at 1100 hours. The format was sequential. Each competitor cycled through the 7 targets with a 10-minute overall window, firing in the order determined by their competitor card. Hits were confirmed by a spotting team positioned laterally with high-power scopes and a radio net that relayed results to Okafor at the scoring table. The radio calls were clinical. Target number. Hit or miss. Time recorded. No editorializing. The first few competitors went through the course the way you'd expect. Clean on the closer plates. Solid on the mid-range. Variable on 1900 meters. 0 for 0 on the final plate, which was becoming a running story that the spotting team confirmed with the same neutral voice every time, as if they'd pre-recorded the call. 7. Miss. Time. Pierce went up at 1340. He went through his pre-engagement ritual with the thoroughness of a man who has made his pre-engagement ritual part of his identity. Breathing exercises. Equipment check. A second equipment check. Not because he doubted the first, but because thoroughness was a thing he wanted the people around him to observe. He settled behind his rifle with the unhurried confidence of someone who has already decided how this goes. He was good. He was genuinely, undeniably good. The first 6 targets fell in a sequence that drew quiet acknowledgement from the serious observers. The kind of acknowledgement that real precision shooters offer, which looks almost identical to no reaction at all but carries enormous weight if you know what you're looking at. Torres nodded. One of the Delta operators, leaning against a post with his arms crossed, uncrossed his arms briefly and then crossed them again. Plate 1. Hit. Plate 2. Hit. Plate 3. Hit. Hit. Wine shifted mid-trigger press, and the hit was barely inside the steel, but it was a hit. Plate 4. Hit. Plate 5. Hit. Plate 6. Hit. Clean. With 3 minutes and 42 seconds remaining. Pierce exhaled. He settled behind his optic on the final plate. The canyon wind that had been a relatively steady 8 knots from the southwest chose this moment to do what canyon winds do, to cycle through 3 different directions in the span of 60 seconds, driven by thermal dynamics that no weather meter could predict with enough granularity to be useful. He fired. The spotting radio cracked. 7, miss. He fired again. 7, miss, time. Pierce stood up from his position with the particular stillness of a man working very hard to keep his expression neutral. He stepped back from the lane. He looked out at the canyon. His hands were completely relaxed at his sides, which told you, if you knew what to look for, exactly how not relaxed the rest of him was. Nobody said anything. He walked to the equipment table and began field stripping his suppressor with careful, methodical movements. The silence around him was not unkind. It was simply the silence of people who understood that the canyon had just made a point that no amount of expensive glass could argue with. Evelyn Cross went up at 1420. The thermal shift Okafor had mentioned was cycling through its variable phase. The thread on her wind indicator was doing 3 different things in what seemed like random sequence. She lay behind her rifle, looked at the thread, looked at her notebook, looked at the thread again. Made 2 final notations, closed the notebook, set it to the side. Her first shot broke so quietly, the M210 suppressor converting the report to a sharp mechanical snap rather than a concussive boom, that some of the observers weren't sure she'd fired until the spotting radio cracked. 1. Hit. She cycled the bolt, waited approximately 4 seconds while watching the thread. 2. Hit. The pattern established itself in the minds of the observers before it was finished. The controlled rhythm. The patience between shots that looked like wasted time until you understood she was reading the wind between engagements rather than shooting through it. The bolt work. Smooth, no wasted motion, the kind of action that takes years of repetition to reduce to pure reflex. 3. Hit. Torres had stopped watching his own scoring sheet. The 2 Delta operators had both uncrossed their arms. Hayes had moved to a direct sightline to her position and was standing absolutely still. 4. Hit. Pierce was looking now too, though looking cost him something visible on his face. 5. Hit. 6. Hit. Evelyn Cross had run 6 consecutive hits on targets from 900 to 1900 meters in a total of 6 minutes and 11 seconds, with a standard-issue military sniper rifle using a piece of sewing thread to read the wind, with the notebook observations made in pencil on paper. The range went quiet in that particular way. Ranges go quiet when something important has just happened and everyone present knows it, and nobody wants to be the first person to speak because speaking might somehow disturb the math. She adjusted her position slightly. Her eye came back to the optic. The thread moved, a sharp, decisive shift from west to southwest that lasted about 3 seconds, then reversed. She fired. The spotting radio said nothing for 3 seconds, 4 seconds, 5, 7, pause. Miss. Wind pushed it. Close. The second attempt came 8 seconds later, after another long observation of the thread. The shot broke clean. The canyon swallowed the sound. 7. Miss. Marginal. A brief pause, then, she's got 3 minutes 20 seconds. The thread moved again. That same 3-second window, the pattern she'd been charting in her notebook since before the competition began. And the range held its collective breath in a way that ranges are not supposed to hold breath, because ranges are supposed to be professional environments where people observe performance without emotional investment, and everyone on the line had completely abandoned that pretense. Her window was closing. The thermal cycle was peaking. In less than 3 minutes, the canyon air would compress against the south wall, and the crosswind would become a living wall of physics that no .308 round shot, not from any rifle, not from any shooter, was going to beat at 2,000 meters. And the seventh plate was still standing. Hayes moved. He didn't announce it. He didn't make a speech. He didn't ask permission or create a moment. He simply walked to his equipment case, opened it, lifted his precision rifle, a custom 338 Lapua Magnum system tuned for exactly this kind of extreme distance work, and carried it to the edge of Evelyn's lane. He set it on the mat beside her, reached into his vest pocket, and produced a single cartridge, which he placed beside the rifle with the careful deliberateness of someone setting down something fragile. He stepped back. "Use this," he said. Just those 2 words. Quiet enough that only the shooters nearest to him heard it clearly. The rest of the range had seen it happen. Nobody spoke. Pierce was 20 feet away, and the expression on his face was something that had not yet found its name. Evelyn turned her head and looked at the rifle beside her. Then she looked at Hayes. Something passed between them. Not communication exactly, but recognition. The specific recognition that exists between people who have done the same work in the same darkness and need no credentials to verify it. She nodded once. She turned to the unfamiliar rifle. She ran her hands along the stock, found the comb, adjusted her cheek weld. Her finger found the trigger geometry without searching. She settled her eye behind the optic and made 2 small adjustments to the parallax. Checked the loaded chamber through force of habit. Moved her left hand forward along the fore end to the precise position where the rifle balanced against her support. She looked at the thread. The 3-second window was coming. She had read the pattern 11 times in the last 40 minutes. She knew its timing the way you know a heartbeat you've had your hand on long enough. The thread shifted. She exhaled halfway. The trigger broke. The 338 round left the muzzle at nearly 3,000 feet per second, and the canyon swallowed it whole, and the range held absolutely still for the 3 seconds it took the bullet to cross 2,240 meters of desert air, thermal gradient, crosswind, and the particular indifferent cruelty of distance. The radio cracked. The spotter's voice came through with something in it that wasn't quite controlled, a fraction of a break in the professional neutrality. The sound of a man who had been doing this for years and was genuinely surprised. 7. Hit. Nobody moved. Not Hayes. Not Torres. Not the Delta operators. Not Okafor at the scoring table. Not Pierce. The metallic ring of the steel plate arrived approximately 1 second after the radio call, carried on the canyon updraft. Clean, sharp, unmistakable. The particular sound of a bullet finding exactly what it was aimed at across a distance that was supposed to make that impossible. And the Red Mesa Precision Center's firing line stood in the kind of silence that only happens when everyone present has just witnessed something they will be thinking about for the rest of their careers, and nobody has yet figured out what to say. And the wind moves through the canyon like nothing happened at all. The silence lasted long enough to become uncomfortable, and then it lasted longer than that. Nobody on the firing line moved for what felt like a full 30 seconds, but was probably closer to 10. The radio stayed quiet. The spotting team on the lateral ridge had confirmed the hit and then gone silent themselves, which was unusual. Normally, they ran a continuous stream of clinical observations between engagements, timing calls, environmental notes, the professional chatter of men doing a technical job. Now there was nothing. Just the canyon wind moving through dead brush and the distant sound of the steel plate settling back from the impact that had rung it like a bell. Okafor was looking at his scoring sheet. Then he was looking at Evelyn. Then he was looking at his scoring sheet again with the expression of a man who needs the numbers to tell him something the numbers haven't told him yet. Evelyn came up from behind the rifle slowly. She didn't stand immediately. She stayed in a partial kneel at the edge of the mat, right hand resting on Hayes' rifle stock, and looked out at the canyon for a moment with the flat, measuring gaze of someone running a final calculation. Whatever she found at the end of it, she kept private. She stood up, handed the rifle back to Hayes with both hands and a slight forward inclination of her head. Not quite a bow, something more like an acknowledgement between equals that doesn't have a name in English, and walked back toward her equipment bag without looking at anyone. "That's," Torres started and stopped. The ranger who'd smiled at Pierce's parking lot joke was now studying the concrete at his feet with specific, focused attention, the way you study something when you need your face to be doing something that isn't reacting. Pierce hadn't moved, but was still 20 feet back from the line, arms at his sides, and the expression on his face had gone through several phases in the last 60 seconds and had landed somewhere between confusion and something that looked almost like vertigo. Like a man who has applied a framework to the world for years and just watched the world decline to cooperate. Hayes walked back to his equipment case and set his rifle inside with the same unhurried care he'd used to carry it out. He closed the latches, stood up, glanced at Pierce once, a flat, unreadable look that lasted about a second, and said, without any words, that what just happened was not a performance and was not directed at anyone in particular, and that Hayes had already moved on internally, and Pierce was welcome to do the same whenever he got around to it. Pierce didn't meet the look. The scoring conference happened at the equipment tables while the final two competitors finished their runs. Okafor laid out the cards, cross-referenced the radio logs from the spotting team, and did the arithmetic with the mechanical patience of a man who has learned to let numbers be numbers without editorializing. Evelyn Cross had hit 6 targets cleanly and put 2 rounds on the 7th plate, both documented misses due to wind, before Hayes' rifle put the 7th down. The question of how to score the engagement was not a simple one, and Okafor knew it, and he set the card aside with a small piece of tape marking it as provisional and moved to the others. Pierce had 6 confirmed hits. No 7th. Technically, by raw score, they were tied at 6. The 7th hit was the question. Okafor would deal with it when the general got down from the tower, because the general being in the observation tower at an unofficial challenge that the army didn't officially sanction was a thing that created certain implications, and Okafor had been doing this long enough to know when a decision needed to be made at a level above his own pay grade. He put both cards on top of the stack and went to get coffee from the thermos at the end of the table. Hayes found Evelyn at the far end of the parking area, leaning against the Tahoe with a bottle of water and her notebook open on the hood. She was making notes, not reviewing the day. She was still gathering data, still watching the canyon's thermal behavior with the same focused attention she'd had before the competition began, as if the competition itself had been a parenthesis inside a larger ongoing observation. He stopped a few feet away. She didn't look up immediately. "You mapped that window," he said. It wasn't a question. "Took about 40 minutes to see the cycle." She turned a page. 3-second window every 4 to 5 minutes. Consistent enough. "How'd you know it'd hold through the shot?" "I didn't." She looked up then. "Best available probability." Hayes was quiet for a moment. He was trying to figure out something about her, and he was doing it in the careful, indirect way of someone who knows that direct questions often get you less information than silence. "You've shot this canyon before," he said. "Okafor told you." "Okafor told me you said you lost twice. He didn't have to tell me. Your dope book looked familiar with the position, the wind thread placement. You didn't figure that out today." Evelyn looked at him steadily. She had a way of making direct eye contact that wasn't aggressive and wasn't warm. It was simply complete, like she was actually paying attention rather than managing an impression. "I lost twice," she said. "Canyon's different every time. You learn something each time." "What'd you learn today?" She looked back at the canyon. "That the thermal shift peaks about 40 minutes later in July than it does in May, and that the plate vibrates for about 2 seconds after a near miss, which changes your reference point for the next shot." Hayes absorbed this. "The near miss told you where the wind was pushing." "The near miss told me how much." She closed the notebook. "Your rifle's chambered for what? 225, 230 grain?" 230. BC? .815. She nodded slightly, as if confirming an estimate she'd already made. "How many yards of dope did you have built for this range?" "I built fresh dope this morning." He paused. "I drove out yesterday, shot the canyon walls, measured the thermals." Something shifted in her expression. Not quite a smile, more the subtle movement of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed. "That's why you knew it would work," she said. "That's why I knew it could work," Hayes said. "There's a difference." She picked up the water bottle, looked at it, put it down. "Why'd you do it?" she asked. The question landed without accusation, just the plain version of itself. Hayes took a moment before answering, and the moment wasn't performance. He was actually thinking about it, which was unusual enough that Evelyn noticed. "Because you earned it," he said finally. "The first 6. You earned those clean. The 7th was an equipment problem, not a shooter problem." He shrugged, a small motion. Seemed wrong to let a ballistic limitation decide the outcome when the skill was already there. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. "That's going to complicate the scoring." "Probably. Pierce isn't going to like it." "Pierce," Hayes said, with the specific neutrality of someone choosing their words around a subject they have opinions about, "is going to feel however he feels about it. That's his business." Evelyn almost said something else. Instead, she picked up her notebook, tucked it under her arm, and looked back at the firing line where Okafor was still bent over his scorecards. "Thank you," she said, "for the rifle." Hayes nodded once. "Good shooting." He walked back toward the line. Evelyn watched him go and then looked out at the 7th plate, still barely visible at this distance, a dark smudge on the canyon wall. And her expression did something complicated that no one was close enough to see. The informal debrief happened in the shade of the range's equipment shed, which was less a shed and more a corrugated metal structure that provided approximately 40% shade and 100% of the hot metallic confined smell of a structure that had been sitting in the Arizona desert for 20 years absorbing heat. Folding chairs had been set up in a rough semicircle. Someone had produced a cooler of water and 2 bags of chips that nobody touched. It was not a mandatory gathering. It never was. But everyone came, which was its own kind of statement. Pierce arrived last. He took a chair at the edge of the group rather than the center, which was a departure from his usual positioning, and he sat with his forearms on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, which was a departure from everything else about him. Okafor stood at the open end of the semicircle with his scoring sheets and the flat expression of a man about to deliver information that he did not personally create and is therefore not responsible for. "Before I go through the results," he said, "General Holloway wants to address the group." Heads turned. Several competitors looked genuinely surprised. Holloway's presence in the tower had been noted by some and ignored by others, but his coming down to the floor level changed the nature of what this gathering was. Holloway walked into the shed from the far end, and the temperature of the room changed in that specific way. It changes when a person of genuine authority enters a space, not because of rank exactly, but because of something carried in the way he moved that communicated a lifetime of decisions made in rooms where the decisions mattered. I was 61 years old and looked it, which in his profession meant something different than it would mean elsewhere. He had the weathered, specific look of someone who had earned their years in the field rather than at a desk. He stopped at the open end of the semicircle beside Okafor. He looked around the group. His eyes moved without hurry, taking inventory. "I'm not going to pretend I was here officially," he said. His voice was the unhurried, moderate register voice of a man who has never needed to raise it to be heard. "You all know why this event runs the way it runs. No cameras, no command presence, no incentive except the work itself." He paused. "I respect that, which is why I stayed in the tower instead of introducing myself this morning." Nobody spoke. Pierce was looking at the floor. "I watched the entire competition from first shot to last," Holloway continued, "and I want to say something before we get to scores because scores are going to be what they are. And I don't want the scores to be the conversation that people remember leaving here today." He looked at Pierce when he said the next part, not exclusively. His eyes moved around the group. But Pierce was clearly included in the geometry of the statement. "This community has a habit," Holloway said. "I've watched it develop over 20 years, and I'm guilty of it myself in different contexts, so this isn't a lecture from a clean conscience. The habit is this. We let equipment become a proxy for competence. We let the sophistication of your setup tell us what we should expect from your performance before you've performed. And we let confidence, the loud, public-facing kind, substitute for the quieter version, which is the only one that actually works under pressure." The shed was very quiet. "Chief Hayes," Holloway said, "did something today that I've seen exactly once before in my career at an event like this. And I want to acknowledge it because it's the kind of thing that doesn't get acknowledged enough. He saw something real, evaluated it correctly, and acted on his evaluation without needing anyone's permission or approval. That's judgment, Real judgment, not the kind that shows up in after-action reports. The kind that shows up in the moment, under pressure, when it matters. Hayes sat with his hands clasped and said nothing. He looked like a man who is uncomfortable with being praised in front of people and is enduring it with patience. Holloway let the moment sit for a second, then moved on. The scoring question from today's final engagement is genuinely complicated, he said. I've talked with Okafor about it. The rules as written don't have clean language for what happened, which is a problem for the rules, not for the people involved. Here's what I'll say for the record. Sergeant Cross hit 6 targets with her issued rifle under field conditions in a time and sequence that would have been competitive at any precision shooting event in the country. The 7th engagement involved a weapon substitution that Okafor is going to have to classify under general rules, but I want everyone in this room to understand what they actually witnessed today, separate from whatever the scoring sheet says. He looked at Evelyn directly for the first time. She met his gaze with the same flat completeness she'd used on Hayes. No visible reaction to being singled out by a 3-star general. No adjustment to posture or expression, just attention. I'll talk to you separately, Holloway said, and moved on before the sentence could become a moment. The separate conversation happened outside the shed, while the others processed scores and did the quiet post-competition social accounting that happens in any high-stakes group. The small adjustments of standing that get negotiated without direct acknowledgement, the way people's positions relative to each other shift in the hour after competition ends. Holloway walked with Evelyn to the far end of the parking area, which put them out of earshot of the shed. He didn't make ceremony of it. He walked the way he did everything, with the unhurried purpose of someone who has already decided where he's going. He stopped. He looked at the canyon for a moment. "How long have you been in the Army?" he asked. 17 years? Unit? She looked at him. Which clearance level are you asking at? Something moved in Holloway's expression. The faint calibration of a man who has just gotten a data point that matters. Most staff sergeants, facing a 3-star general's direct question, do not respond with a clearance level query. The fact that she had, and had delivered it without aggression or apology, as a completely reasonable and professional response, told him something. "Whatever level your current cover assignment allows," he said. Evelyn Cross looked at the canyon. She was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone deciding whether to answer, but the quiet of someone deciding how much of an answer serves the present situation. 10th Special Forces Group, she said finally. Before that, a classified program under JSOC that I'm still not going to describe in a parking lot. She paused. My current assignment is an operational evaluation role, which is why the cover is what it is. Holloway nodded slowly. He'd served long enough that this kind of partial disclosure, delivered in this kind of register, landed with its full weight rather than its abbreviated content. The canyon whines, he said. You've shot them before. 3 times. This was my 4th. You said you lost twice. I did. What about the 3rd time? She looked at him. Something behind her eyes was making a quiet calculation. The 3rd time, she said, wasn't a competition. Holloway held her gaze for a moment. Then he looked away, which was its own kind of answer. The look of a man who has heard enough to understand what he's not going to be told and has made his peace with that. The evaluation role, he said. What are you evaluating? Long-range sniper program curriculum. There's a gap in how we're teaching environmental reading at extreme distances. The programs are still heavily technology dependent, good technology. But there are operating environments where you don't have the technology and you need the skill to exist underneath it. She paused. I'm trying to identify what that curriculum looks like. Holloway was quiet for several seconds. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted slightly. Not softer, but more considered, the voice of someone engaging with substance rather than surface. You came to Iron Horizon as part of that evaluation. I came to watch how the best practitioners in the field actually solve the problem in a competitive environment, what they rely on, what they default to under pressure. She looked at the line. Today was informative. Chief Hayes, Holloway said, among others. She paused. Hayes is the most interesting case study on the line today. He's built the skill set to operate underneath the technology. He's not dependent on the meters and the calculators the way most of the other competitors are. He actually reads the environment. A brief pause. He also made a judgment call that nobody else made, which tells you something else about him. What does it tell you? That his decision-making is as good as his shooting, which is rarer than you'd think. Holloway looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon sun was past its peak, and the canyon walls were throwing long shadows across the parking area. Somewhere on the line, Okafor was calling the final scores. "How long is your evaluation period?" Holloway asked. 6 months. I'm in month 4. "And after?" "I write the curriculum, find the instructors, recommend the implementation." She looked at him steadily. "It's a long process." "Who's your program director?" "Colonel Francis Whitmore, SOCOM Training Office." Holloway filed this with the specific care of a man doing mental filing rather than physical. He looked at the canyon one more time, then back at Evelyn. "You needed Hayes's rifle," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even a statement exactly. More of a question wearing a statement's clothes. "Yes," she said. "Does that bother you?" She thought about it, genuinely, in real time, the way a person thinks about something they haven't been asked before. "It would have bothered me 6 years ago," she said. "Now it just tells me where the gaps are." Holloway didn't respond to that. He just nodded, once, with the slow, complete quality of a nod that means I understand, and I believe you, and possibly also I remember feeling that way once. "Good shooting today, Sergeant Cross," he said, and he walked back toward the shed, leaving Evelyn in the parking area with the canyon behind her and the afternoon wind picking up off the rock, carrying dust and the distant metallic smell of cooling rifle barrels. She stood there for a moment. Then she picked up her notebook from the Tahoe's hood, where she'd left it, and wrote 3 more lines of observation about the wind pattern before the light changed enough to make the distant plate invisible. She wrote them carefully. With a mechanical pencil she kept sharpened to a fine point, pressing hard enough that the page retained the impression even in the heat. Then she closed the notebook, got in the truck, and drove back toward the highway with the windows down and the radio off, watching the canyon recede in the rearview mirror with the flat, considering attention of someone who has not yet finished thinking about what today meant. Pierce was the last person to leave the range. He'd stayed while everyone else packed and talked and did the parking lot social work of ending a competition day. He'd stayed after Hayes loaded his equipment into a government vehicle and drove away with 2 of the other SEAL operators without much ceremony. He'd stayed after Torres and the other Rangers left in their convoy, and after the Delta operators departed in their rental car with the civilian plates, and after Okafor folded the last table and locked the scoring office. He stood at lane 3, his lane, and looked at the 7th plate in the canyon wall. You couldn't really see it from here anymore. The light was wrong, and the distance was what it was. He stood there for a while. He was not the kind of man who easily accessed the internal accounting that the last few hours required. He had built a substantial and comfortable architecture of self-assessment over his career, and that architecture was load-bearing. It supported a lot of his daily function. What had happened today didn't demolish it, but it had done something to the foundation, something he could feel without yet being able to describe. He'd been better than almost everyone else on that line today. That was true, and it was real, and he knew it. He also knew that Evelyn Cross had done things with a standard-issue rifle that he couldn't have done with his custom-built $50,000 system, and had done them quietly, without performance, without requiring anyone's attention or approval, and without, as far as he could tell, caring very much what he or anyone else thought about it. That last part was the thing working at the foundation. He picked up his case, started walking to his truck, stopped halfway across the parking area for reasons he couldn't have explained, and turned around and looked at the canyon one more time, at the section of wall where plate 7 was, invisible now in the failing light. He stood there for a moment, then he got in his truck and drove. The desert closed behind him, and the canyon settled into the particular dark silence of a place that holds whatever happens inside it, without judgment and without memory, indifferent to scores and reputations, and the specific human difficulty of finding out, at whatever age you find it out, that the world is wider than the frame you've been using to measure it. The 7th plate sat in the dark at the end of the canyon. It didn't care who hit it, it just waited, the way targets wait, for whatever came next. 3 weeks after Iron Horizon, the curriculum evaluation report sat on Evelyn's desk in a temporary office at Fort Huachuca with 47 pages written and an undetermined number remaining, and she was staring at page 48's blank opening line with the specific, frustrated attention of someone who knows exactly what needs to be said and cannot yet find the correct way to say it. The office was a repurposed storage room with a window that looked at a wall and a desk that had been borrowed from somewhere else, identifiable by the 4 different sets of scratches on the surface that told 4 different stories about 4 different previous occupants. Her laptop sat open. Her notebook, the same spiral-bound notebook from Iron Horizon, now supplemented by 2 additional pages tucked into the back cover, lay open beside it. The mechanical pencil was sharpened to the same fine point. On the wall, she'd taped a single sheet of paper with a rough diagram of the Iron Horizon Canyon, the 7 target positions marked in pencil, and a series of wind notation arrows that looked like abstract art to anyone who didn't know the language. She was not looking at the diagram, she was looking at the blank page. Her desk phone rang. She looked at it the way you look at something interrupting a thought you haven't finished. She picked it up on the 3rd ring. Cross. Sergeant Cross. The voice was male, clipped, with the accent of someone who grew up in the mid-Atlantic and had spent decades in institutional environments that gradually smooth regional edges without eliminating them entirely. "This is Colonel Whitmore's office. Hold for the Colonel." She held. The hold music was the Army's standard phone system default, a faint, tinny instrumental that had been the same since the 90s, and that she had heard in enough waiting contexts over enough years that it had become one of those sounds that exists outside of time, like elevator music or airplane white noise. Sergeant Cross. Colonel Francis Whitmore's voice was direct in the way of someone who has spent a career in environments where directness is a resource and indirection is a liability. "I've been reading your interim notes, the technology dependency observation." "Yes, ma'am." "It's causing some friction." Evelyn set her pencil down. "I'd expect it to." "The friction is at the program director level, not the instructional level. The instructors are actually receptive. It's the budget people who have a problem. Specifically, the people who signed the contracts for the technology systems you're describing as crutches. I didn't use the word crutch in the report. You used compensatory dependency, which in committee language means the same thing and lands harder." A brief pause. "The Iron Horizon observation data. How complete is it?" "Complete enough." "I need numbers, Cross. I need comparative performance data between technology-assisted and environment-reading-based engagements. What you observed at Iron Horizon is anecdote without the numbers." Evelyn looked at the canyon diagram on the wall. "I have the competition logs, spotter radio data, time to engagement figures for each competitor, environmental conditions cross-referenced against. That's a start. I need more." Another pause, longer. "There's a practical evaluation being scheduled. Live fire exercise at the Mountain Warfare Training Center in Bridgeport. 3 weeks from Thursday. It's a joint curriculum review. They're assessing the new technology package against the old manual methods in a controlled environment. I want you there." "As an observer?" "As a participant." Whitmore's voice was carefully neutral in the specific way of someone delivering information they expect to be pushed back on. They need a demonstrator, someone who can run the manual method under live evaluation conditions so the review committee can compare it directly against the tech-assisted team's results. The silence on Evelyn's end lasted long enough that Whitmore spoke again. "I know it's outside the scope of what we discussed for the evaluation role." "It's not the scope I'm concerned about," Evelyn said. "Then what?" "Who's on the review committee?" Whitmore was quiet for a moment. "Brigadier General Thomas Cray, 2 colonels from SOCOM training, and," another pause, "a civilian contractor representative from the company that makes the technology package." Evelyn picked up her pencil, set it down again. "That's not a review committee, that's a procurement defense." "I know what it is," Whitmore said, and her voice had something in it now, something compressed and precise, the voice of a woman who has been in institutional systems long enough to know the difference between a fight worth picking and a fight worth winning, and who does not confuse the two. "I also know that the only way to make the report matter is to make the data undeniable. And the only way to make the data undeniable is to generate it in front of the people who are going to argue against it." Evelyn looked at the blank page 48. "What are the range conditions at Bridgeport in October?" "Variable," Whitmore said. They're scheduling it for the 3rd week. Sierra Nevada elevation, morning thermals, afternoon crosswind off the ridgeline. Temperature differential of about 30 degrees between morning and peak afternoon. Variable is the polite word. Yes, Whitmore said. There was something in the brief pause that followed that suggested she understood the reference even without context. Can you be there? Evelyn closed her notebook. Yes, ma'am. Good. I'll send the operational parameters tonight. The committee doesn't know your background. They're being told you're an evaluation specialist. Your cover assignment holds for this exercise. Understood. Cross. Whitmore's voice shifted slightly, not softer, but more considered. The civilian contractor is going to be a problem. How much of a problem? The kind that comes with legal counsel and a contract worth $48 million. A pause. His name is Richard Calloway. He's been managing the DoD account for the technology package for 6 years. He's very good at making numbers tell whatever story the contract needs them to tell. Evelyn absorbed this. And the committee will let him speak during the evaluation? He has a standing invitation to all curriculum review exercises that involve his company's products. It's in the contract language. Evelyn stopped. She didn't finish the sentence because the word she was reaching for was unprofessional and she was in a professional conversation. Yes, Whitmore said, in the tone of someone acknowledging a problem they did not create and cannot fully solve. It is. The Mountain Warfare Training Center sat in the High Sierra at nearly 7,000 feet, a sprawling installation that existed for the specific purpose of training soldiers to operate in conditions that tried to kill them through means other than enemy action. Cold, altitude, terrain, the particular combination of factors that turned a manageable tactical situation at sea level into a life-threatening one at elevation, and that required a fundamentally different physical and cognitive approach that could only be learned by being there. In October, the installation was in the final weeks of its warm season cycle, the window before the first Sierra snowfall, when temperatures were variable enough to provide genuine training conditions without the extreme cold that would arrive by November. The mountains around the facility were already showing color at the higher elevations, the high-altitude brush cycling through its abbreviated version of autumn, while the lower slopes stayed brown and dry. Evelyn arrived on a Tuesday. The evaluation was scheduled for Thursday. She used Wednesday for what she always used pre-evaluation days for: observation. She walked the range in the morning, starting at dawn when the mountain air was still and cold enough to see her breath, and spent 4 hours in quiet, systematic movement through the terrain that the evaluation would use. She didn't carry her rifle. She carried her notebook and a small handheld anemometer and the mechanical pencil. The range occupied a natural ridge system with firing positions on a south-facing slope and target positions across a shallow valley at distances between 800 and 1,800 meters. The terrain channeled wind in predictable patterns that were nonetheless variable enough to require continuous reading rather than a single pre-shot calculation. She mapped the terrain flow. She noted where rock formations created deflection that wouldn't be obvious from the firing position. She identified the specific features that the morning thermal pattern used as its organizing principle: the east-facing cliff that heated first and generated the initial upslope draft, the shadow gap between two ridges where cold air pooled overnight and released slowly through the morning. By noon, she had 6 pages of notes and a headache from the altitude that she treated with water and 2 ibuprofen and continued working. The technology team arrived Wednesday afternoon in 2 vehicles, the second of which was a cargo van carrying equipment cases with foam padding visible through the partially open rear doors. There were 4 of them, 3 military personnel and 1 civilian who was dressed in civilian clothing that communicated a very specific kind of institutional comfort: the blazer and tactical pants combination of someone who moves between DoD environments and corporate environments with enough frequency to have developed a wardrobe that signals competence in both without fully committing to either. Richard Calloway was approximately 50, with the physique of someone who had been athletic in his 30s and had since made peace with the transition to a more sedentary professional life without making complete peace with it. He moved well. He was observant in ways that weren't military trained but were something else. The particular alertness of a man who earns his living by reading rooms and calibrating his behavior to what the room requires. He noticed Evelyn immediately, not in any remarkable way. He noticed everything in a space, which was the skill, but he cataloged her in the specific way of someone wondering where she fit in the evaluation's power structure. She was in uniform, without rank displayed on the outer layer of her cold weather gear. Standard practice for the exercise, where demonstrators operated under evaluation conditions rather than command hierarchy. Her name tape was covered by a thin strip of black tape, part of the cover protocol Whitmore had established. To Calloway, she looked like a soldier of indeterminate rank assigned to the evaluation in some technical support capacity. He smiled at her across the equipment staging area with the easy, practiced warmth of someone who has spent years making people feel seen without actually seeing them. She looked at him for approximately 1 second and went back to her notebook. The evaluation briefing happened Thursday morning at 0600 in the range's main building, which smelled of old coffee and industrial cleaning product and the particular ambient residue of thousands of hours of mission planning conducted in rooms like this one. Brigadier General Thomas Cray sat at the head of the table, compact, precise, with the energy of someone who has learned to be very efficient because his time is genuinely limited. The two SOCOM colonels sat on either side of him. Calloway sat at the table's side with a laptop open and the expression of someone who has been in this exact configuration before and is comfortable with it. Evelyn sat at the far end of the table. She had her notebook. "The structure is simple," Cray said, without preamble. "The opening of a man who assumes everyone in the room has already read the preparatory materials. 2 teams, same targets, same conditions, sequential runs starting at 0800. Team Alpha uses the full technology package, Calloway's system, current configuration, the hardware and software as deployed in the field. Team Bravo runs the manual method, environmental reading, analog dope, no electronic assistance beyond a basic rifle scope." He looked at his sheet. "Demonstrator for Team Bravo is," he paused, reading the cover designation, "Evaluator Cross." Calloway's head turned toward Evelyn with a slightly different attention than before. He looked at her with the recalibrated interest of someone revising an initial assessment. "Evaluator," he said, which wasn't quite a question. "That's correct," Cray said, in the tone of someone who is not inviting the tangent. Calloway nodded and said nothing further, but his eyes stayed on Evelyn for a moment longer than necessary, running the arithmetic of her. The plain uniform, the notebook, the apparent rank ambiguity, against the evaluation context. He filed something. Evelyn could see him file it. 7 targets, Cray continued, ranges from 800 to 1800 meters. 5-minute engagement window per target sequence. Committee will observe both runs and score on hit rate, time to engagement, and consistency across variable conditions. Questions? One of the colonels, a tall woman named Vickers, who had the posture of someone who completed her morning run before most people's alarms went off, asked about wind measurement protocol. Cray answered it, standard confirmation. Calloway raised his hand with the practiced ease of a man for whom institutional protocol is a tool rather than a constraint. Just for transparency, the technology package we're demonstrating has been updated since the last evaluation cycle. The ballistic processing speed has increased by about 40%, and we've integrated a new multi-axis wind measurement that samples at 3-second intervals rather than the previous 15. He smiled around the table. "I want the committee to have the current baseline, not the old one." "Noted," Cray said. "It goes in the evaluation log." Calloway nodded. He looked at Evelyn. "Evaluator Cross, what's your baseline for the manual method? How many hours of range time in comparable conditions?" The question was delivered pleasantly. It was a pleasant question wearing the clothing of a reasonable inquiry while functioning as something else. An early positioning move. A way of establishing that the manual method was a person rather than a system, with a person's limitations and specific training history rather than a system's consistent, documentable performance specs. Everyone at the table understood what the question was doing. Cray's expression didn't change. Vickers looked at her coffee. Evelyn looked at Calloway with the same flat, complete attention she'd used at Iron Horizon. "Enough," she said. Calloway's smile stayed. "Could you be more specific for the evaluation log?" 312 documented range sessions in variable mountain conditions over 11 years, she said, including 8 live operational engagements at ranges above 1,500 meters, 4 of those without electronic assistance of any kind. She held his gaze. "I can get you the session logs if that's useful for the evaluation record." The smile on Calloway's face didn't disappear. It just changed quality, becoming the smile of a man adjusting to new information rather than the smile of a man managing a conversation he controls. "That would actually be very useful," he said. "Then I'll get them to you," Evelyn said, and looked back at Cray. Cray moved to the next agenda item with the momentum of a man who has just watched exactly what he expected to watch and is satisfied that it went the way it went. Team Alpha went first. The technology package was genuinely impressive. Evelyn sat in the observer position behind the firing line and watched with the careful, specifically focused attention of someone generating data rather than forming opinions. And what she recorded in her notebook was not qualitative judgment, but raw observation, timestamps, response sequences, the specific delays between environmental input and firing solution output. The system worked the way good technology works when the conditions are within its design parameters, cleanly, quickly, with a consistency that human judgment can't match in the short term. The team's shooter, a staff sergeant named Garza, who was clearly skilled and clearly comfortable with the system, ran the first 4 targets with an efficiency that drew quiet approval from Vickers and a nod from Cray. The system's multi-axis wind sampler ran its 3-second cycle. The ballistic processor updated the firing solution. Garza fired on the solution, hit, 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 hit. Target 5 sat at 1,400 meters in a section of the valley where the ridge geometry created a deflection pattern that wasn't obvious from the firing position and that Evelyn had spent 40 minutes mapping the previous day. The wind at the firing position read consistently from the northwest. The wind at the target was doing something different, using the rock formation she'd noted to curve southwest in the final 400 meters before the plate. The system read the firing position wind. It processed the data it had, which was accurate data. It generated a firing solution based on that data. Garza fired. 5. Miss. He fired again, faster, within the processing window. 5. Miss. Adjusted. The system recalibrated. 3rd shot. 5. Hit 3 rounds. Evelyn wrote, Target 5. Deflection zone, 3 rounds to solution, system read firing position wind only, no terrain effect compensation. She underlined terrain effect compensation and added a star. Targets 6 and 7 went clean. Final score, 7 targets, 9 rounds, all hits. Time, 14 minutes, 22 seconds across the full sequence. Calloway was leaning forward in the observer position with the expression of someone watching their investment perform, which it had, solidly, within the expected range. "Good system," Vickers said, to no one in particular. "Very good system," Calloway said, which was a different statement. Awesome. Evelyn's preparation for Team Bravo's run took 11 minutes. She went to her firing position, set up her mat, planted her wind indicator thread in the position she'd identified the day before, based on the terrain flow mapping, not at the mat's standard edge, but 6 inches to the right, where the local airflow at the position gave a slightly cleaner read of the valley's dominant pattern. She opened her notebook to the page she'd been building since Wednesday at dawn. She looked at the thread. She looked at the terrain. She started building her firing solutions the way she always built them, not from a processor, but from the accumulated intersection of environmental observation, ballistic knowledge, and the specific kind of quiet internal mathematics that 11 years of practice had reduced to something that looked, from outside, like instinct. It wasn't instinct, it was just very fast experience. Calloway was watching from the observer position. He'd picked up his own notebook, a professional's move, Evelyn noted, the move of someone who takes good data seriously regardless of which direction it points. He wrote something. She didn't try to read it. Cray said, "Evaluator Cross, you may begin when ready." Evelyn looked at the thread for 4 more seconds. The thermal shift she'd mapped was cycling through its morning phase. The east cliff had been heating for 2 hours, and the upslope draft was in its consistent window. She had approximately 20 minutes of relative stability before the pattern shifted into its mid-morning variable phase. She looked at target 1, 800 meters, standard. She fired. 1, hit. She cycled the bolt, watched the thread for 2 seconds, fired. 2, hit. The rhythm established itself. The observers in the gallery, Cray, Vickers, the second colonel, Calloway, settled into the particular stillness of people watching something that requires attention. Not the polite attention of observers doing their job, but the involuntary attention of people who recognize that something worth watching is happening. She didn't rush. That was the thing that Calloway wrote in his notebook without fully understanding he was noting it. She didn't rush, but she also didn't hesitate. And the two things together created a pace that was deceptively fast, because the time between shots was not wasted time, but working time. Each interval spent in active environmental reading that fed the next shot's solution, rather than waiting for a processor to update. Target 3. Hit. Target 4. Hit. Target 5. The deflection zone she'd mapped. She settled behind the optic, adjusted her elevation 2 clicks for the range, then drifted her windage a half mil to the left of the solution her position's wind would have suggested. The correction was based not on what the thread was telling her about the firing position wind, but on what the rock formation visible from her position was telling her about the wind at distance. A terrain reading skill that took years to develop and that no currently deployed technology package measured, because measuring it required first knowing it existed. She fired. 5. Hit. First round. In the observer gallery, Calloway stopped writing. He looked at the scoring sheet, then at the range, then at Evelyn. Vickers said nothing. She was watching the target markers with an expression that Cray recognized and filed. Targets 6 and 7, clean, 7 targets, 7 rounds, all hits. Time, 11 minutes, 41 seconds across the full sequence. The range went quiet in the specific way of a space where the math has just changed and everyone present knows it and is doing the institutional arithmetic of what it means. Not just for this exercise, but for the report and the committee, and the $48 million contract that Calloway's legal team had not spent 6 years defending in order to have it challenged by a soldier with a notebook and a piece of sewing thread. Calloway stood up from the observer position slowly. He had the controlled energy of a man who is not panicking because panicking is bad tactics, but who is running the problem very fast in a part of his mind that his face is working hard not to show. "I'd like to request a second run," he said. His voice was level. "Under afternoon conditions. For data completeness." Cray looked at him. "That's not in the evaluation protocol." "The protocol allows for supplemental data collection at the committee's discretion," Calloway said. He'd pulled this from memory. The contract language, the evaluation framework. He'd read it many times. "Given the gap in results, I think the committee would benefit from seeing both methods under variable conditions rather than the current stable window." Vickers looked at Cray. "He's right about the protocol." Cray was quiet for a moment. He was looking at Evelyn's position on the firing line. She was still there, notebook open, writing. He watched her write. He watched the specific patience of what she was doing, not waiting for the decision, but using the time to observe, the way she had used every available moment since arriving at this facility. "Cross," Cray called. "Calloway wants a second run under afternoon conditions. Variable wine temperature differential. Are you willing?" Evelyn looked up from her notebook. She looked at Cray, then at Calloway in the observer gallery, with the same flat, complete attention. Calloway met her gaze with the steady, practiced expression of a professional who never lets anyone see the interior of his calculations. She looked back at the canyon. The afternoon thermal would shift in approximately 4 hours. The crosswind off the eastern ridgeline would increase to 15, possibly 18 knots. The temperature differential would create a density-altitude change that affected bullet ballistics in ways that the flat-range dope in most shooters' books didn't account for. It would be genuinely harder. Not impossible, but harder. "Yes," she said. Calloway nodded once, and something in the nod was neither gracious nor unkind. It was simply the acknowledgement of a man who has just committed to a course of action and is already thinking 4 moves ahead. "Good," Cray said. He looked at Vickers. "Log it. 1,400 hours. Ita." The 4 hours between runs had a specific texture that Evelyn recognized from other high-stakes waiting periods. The particular weight of time that knows it matters, that has consequence attached to it, that presses on the back of your thinking even when you're doing something else. She ate lunch alone at a field table outside the main building, watching the eastern ridgeline and the way the cloud shadows moved across it. Reading the wind's afternoon intentions in the slow, patient way she read everything. Hayes called at 12:30. She hadn't given him the number for this facility. He'd gotten it through channels that she didn't ask about, because Hayes getting information through channels was not a thing worth being surprised by. "Heard you're doing an eval at Bridgeport," he said. "How'd you hear that?" "Vickers and I were in the same battalion in 2019. She mentioned there was a manual method demonstrator on the evaluation. A pause. Said she reminded her of someone. Evelyn looked at the ridgeline. And you put it together. You're not exactly a crowd. He paused. How'd the morning run go? 7 for 7. First round on every target. A brief silence, including the deflection zone on the back half. She looked at the phone. How do you know about the deflection zone? I did a familiarization exercise at Bridgeport in 2021. The ridge geometry on the south-facing range does something interesting at about 1,400 meters if you know to look for it. Another pause. Most people don't. The technology system missed it. 3 rounds. Hayes said nothing for a moment. The contractor's pushing for a second run. Afternoon conditions. That's a harder problem. Yes. You built the afternoon data yesterday? I built what I could in 6 hours. The afternoon thermal is less predictable than the morning because the temperature differential creates a layering effect at midfield. The wind at firing position and the wind at target are running slightly different densities. The ballistic compensation has to account for both. Density altitude correction in addition to wind. Yes. Hayes was quiet for several seconds. What's the contractor running for the tech package? Multi-axis wind at 3-second cycles. Ballistic processor with a 40% speed upgrade since the last cycle. She paused. It's good hardware. Genuinely good. But it doesn't measure what it doesn't know to measure. She looked at the ridgeline. The terrain effect. The deflection geometry. The density layering at midfield. These aren't inputs the system is designed to capture because the system was designed for flat range and open terrain engagement, not mountain canyon geometry. She paused. Callaway knows this. He's not stupid. He's hoping the afternoon variable conditions make the human error factor large enough to close the gap. Will they? She was quiet for a moment. Not if I've read the terrain correctly. And if you haven't? She looked at the ridgeline with the flat, assessing gaze of someone who has been honest with themselves about failure enough times to have stopped finding it catastrophic. Then the data goes in the report as a mixed result, and we redesign the evaluation methodology and run it again with better controls. A pause. The report is what matters, not today's run. Hayes said, That's a very rational way to think about something you're clearly going to win. Something moved at the edge of her expression that wasn't quite a smile. You don't know that. No, Hayes said. But I know you mapped the terrain for 6 hours in the cold yesterday, and I know you ran 7 for 7 this morning on the first round every time, and I know you're sitting outside right now watching the ridgeline instead of eating lunch. A pause. So, she looked at the table. Her lunch was half eaten. Go eat your lunch, Hayes said, and hung up. She picked up the fork, ate 3 bites, looked at the ridgeline, set the fork down, and picked up her notebook. At 1400 hours, the eastern ridgeline delivered exactly what it had promised. The crosswind came off the high terrain in the shifting, layered pattern she'd mapped. Not a clean directional flow, but a set of overlapping currents generated by the temperature differential between the sunlit upper elevations and the shadowed valley floor, creating a wind environment that her anemometer measured at the firing position as variable 12 to 16 knots, while her terrain reading told her the midfield density layer was doing something different in the 600 meters between firing position and far target. Callaway's team went first again. The technology system ran its cycles. The processor updated. Garza shot with the same clean discipline as the morning. He was a good shooter, and the observation wasn't wrong. 7 targets, 13 rounds, 6 hits, 1 miss on the target 5 deflection zone that the system had also struggled with in the morning, now complicated further by the afternoon density layering that affected bullet deceleration differently than the processor's sea-level calibrated algorithms expected. Time, 17 minutes, 8 seconds. Callaway logged his own numbers with the expression of a man doing triage, finding the best narrative available in a dataset that was not telling his preferred story. Evelyn took her position. The thread moved in the complex layered pattern she'd spent the morning observing from the eastern edge of the range, cross-referencing it against the terrain diagram in her notebook until she understood not just what it was doing, but why. The specific rock formation at elevation that was splitting the incoming flow, the shadow gap that was holding cold air and creating a density floor at roughly 500 meters out, The way the two effects combined at the 1400-meter deflection zone to create a wind environment that was genuinely different from what either the firing position instruments or the standard terrain assumptions would predict. She made 3 final notes, closed the notebook. Cray said, "Cross. Begin when ready." She looked at the thread. The afternoon wind moved through its layered pattern, a 6 to 8 second shift window between the dominant northwest flow and the secondary southwest component, generated by the valley's thermal cycling. She'd measured it 14 times since noon. She fired on the shift window. 1. Hit. She didn't rush between shots. The rhythm of the afternoon was different from the morning, slower, because the shift windows were less frequent, and the interval between them was working time, not waiting time. She used every second of it. 2. Hit. 3. Hit. Vickers had leaned forward in the observer position. The second colonel had stopped writing in his evaluation sheet and was just watching. 4. Hit. Target 5. The deflection zone. The density layering. The intersection of all the morning's mapping and the afternoon's observation and 11 years of exactly this kind of slow, patient, ground truth, environmental reading conducted in places and under conditions that she still couldn't describe to anyone in this room. She adjusted her windage not for the firing position wind, not for the standard terrain correction, but for the specific combination that her notebook told her was operating at this range, at this temperature differential, at this time of day. She fired. The range held very still. 5. Hit. First round. Calloway set his pen down on the table. He did it carefully, without sound, the way you set something down when you need your hands free to think. 6. Hit. 7. Hit. 7 targets, 7 rounds, all hits. The silence that followed was different from the morning's silence, denser, with more weight behind it, because this was not the first run anymore. This was the second run, under harder conditions, after Calloway had specifically requested the conditions that were supposed to introduce enough human error margin to change the outcome. The outcome had not changed. Cray looked at the scoring sheets for a long moment. Then he looked at Calloway. Calloway was looking at the firing line where Evelyn was kneeling behind her rifle, making the last notation in her notebook with the same mechanical pencil, pressing the same fine point into the same worn spiral-bound pages, as if the afternoon had been simply another data point in a study that was still ongoing. Calloway picked his pen back up. He wrote something in his own notebook. His expression was neutral, professionally, thoroughly neutral, in the specific way of a man who is very good at what he does, and who has just encountered a problem that his professional skill set does not have a clean answer to. He looked at the range, at the 7th target barely visible at the end of the valley. He wrote something else, and then he closed his notebook, and the click of the clasp was the only sound in the observer gallery, and the mountain wind moved through the ridgeline pines above them with the indifferent continuity of something that doesn't register human outcomes, and the scoring sheet in Cray's hand said 7 for 7, first round, both runs, and the number didn't care what it cost. The debrief was supposed to start at 1600 hours. It started at 1542 because Calloway requested it early, which told Cray something, and Cray told his aide to move the committee into the main building conference room without the 15-minute buffer he normally kept between range operations and formal review. The buffer existed for a reason. It gave people time to decompress, to let the heat of the range cool into something more manageable before the institutional language started. Calloway knew this. He was collapsing the buffer on purpose, which meant he wanted people in the room before they'd finished processing what they'd seen, which meant he'd already decided on his approach, and the approach required a specific emotional temperature in the room. Evelyn recognized the move. She'd seen it in different configurations, the way people with institutional leverage used procedural tools to manage environments they couldn't control through direct means. She walked into the conference room with her notebook and sat at the same end of the table she'd occupied during the morning brief, which put her at the maximum distance from Calloway and gave her a direct sightline to Cray. Calloway had set up a laptop at the head-adjacent position and had a presentation already loaded. The first slide was visible before everyone sat down. A split-column comparison chart with technology package performance metrics on the left and manual method performance on the right. He'd built it fast, which meant he'd built it before the afternoon run, which meant he'd built it for the outcome he expected rather than the outcome that happened. He'd since updated the right column's numbers, but the chart structure still reflected its original intent, a document designed to frame the comparison favorably. Evelyn looked at the chart, looked at her notebook, wrote one word, framing. Cray sat down, looked at the chart. His expression didn't change, which was its own kind of information. Before we go to the data, Calloway said, I want to acknowledge what we saw today. Both runs. He paused, and the pause was calibrated, long enough to seem genuine, short enough to maintain momentum. Evaluator Cross is an exceptional shooter. What she demonstrated today is a genuine skill set that has real operational value. I don't want the committee to lose sight of that in the data discussion. Vickers said, the data discussion is the point of the evaluation. Absolutely, Calloway said, without missing a beat. What I'm saying is that the data needs context. And the context is that what we observe today is one individual performing at an extreme right tail of the human performance distribution. The question the committee needs to answer is not whether this skill set exists, clearly it does, but whether it's scalable, whether a curriculum built around manual environmental reading can produce this level of performance across a population of students, rather than selecting for the rare individuals who arrive with the underlying aptitude already developed. He clicked to the next slide. The technology package, he said, produced 7 hits out of 7 targets in both runs, with a first-round hit rate of 83% in the morning and 77% in the afternoon. Across the student population that's been trained on this system over the last 3 years, the average performance is consistent within 12% of those figures, 12% variance across hundreds of trained operators. He paused. That's what scalable looks like. The second colonel, a quiet man named Ferris, who had said almost nothing during the evaluation, and whose silence had the quality of someone who listens more than he talks, because listening has historically served him better, leaned forward slightly. What's the variance on the manual method across trained operators? That's the question, Calloway said, looking at Evelyn. Everyone looked at Evelyn. She set her pencil down. She'd known this question was coming, not because she'd anticipated Calloway's specific strategy, but because the question was the right question. It was the strongest argument available to anyone defending the technology package, and it happened to be true. The variance is higher, she said, significantly higher in the first 18 months of training. It compresses over time, but the learning curve is steeper and longer than technology-assisted training. She paused. That's in the report. So you agree, Calloway said. I agree that manual environmental reading takes longer to train to a consistent standard than operating a well-designed technology system. She looked at him directly. I don't agree that scalability is the only relevant evaluation criterion. What other criterion matters more than whether you can train a population of soldiers to this standard reliably? Whether the system works when the technology fails, she said. The room was quiet for a moment. Battery life, sensor damage from field conditions, electronic warfare environments where active sensors create targeting signatures, mountainous terrain where the sensor package loses its calibration reference and defaults to flat-range algorithms. She looked at the chart on Calloway's screen, specifically at the left column's performance metrics. Your system performed very well today on the deflection zone target on the 3rd attempt in the morning and the miss in the afternoon. In a controlled evaluation environment with functioning hardware and optimal sensor conditions. My question for the committee is, what happens to that performance figure when the hardware is a casualty and the shooter has to solve the problem without it? Ferris wrote something on his notepad. Calloway clicked to a new slide, a maintenance and reliability chart. Field reliability for the current package is 91% over a 12-month operational period. 9% failure rate, Vickers said. 91% reliability, Calloway said. That's the same number, Vickers said, and her voice had a quality in it that Calloway recognized as the tone of someone who is not going to be managed by framing. Cray had been listening with his arms crossed and his chin down, the posture of a man doing the real work of the meeting inside his own head, while the surface conversation ran its course. He looked up now. Cross, he said. The curriculum you're developing. Walk me through what it actually teaches, concretely. Not the framework, the specific skills. Evelyn picked up her notebook. Not to read from it, but as a habit when organizing a technical explanation, the physical anchor. Phase 1 is terrain reading, she said. Understanding how landform geometry affects airflow at operational distances. Canyon walls, ridgeline breaks, urban building corridors, all of them create deflection and channeling effects that the wind at your firing position doesn't accurately represent. This is the skill that technology packages currently don't measure, because measuring it requires understanding the physics of terrain interaction, which requires a model of the specific terrain you're operating in, which means the sensor data you're collecting at the firing position is incomplete as an input. How long to teach that? Minimum 6 weeks of field time in variable terrain. The classroom component is maybe 40 hours. The rest is observation hours. You have to see the wind behave in terrain to understand the pattern. You can't read it from a textbook. What's week 7? Environmental timing. Thermals, density-altitude shifts. The way temperature differential between elevation zones creates layered wind patterns. This is what the technology package handled less cleanly in the afternoon run. The density layering at midfield created a ballistic effect that the system's flat-range algorithms didn't compensate for. Cray nodded. He looked at Calloway. Is that a correctable issue in the software? Calloway hesitated. A microsecond, barely perceptible, but Evelyn caught it. It's on the development roadmap. Terrain effect modeling is a complex integration, and the current sensor package doesn't generate the input data that would be needed to. So no, Ferris said, quietly, without inflection. Calloway looked at him. It requires additional development investment. How much? We'd need to scope it before I could give you a number. Ballpark. Calloway paused again. 8 to 12 million, depending on the sensor upgrade requirements. Cray looked at the ceiling for a moment, then at his hands, then at Evelyn. The curriculum development cost, he said. What's the estimate? For full implementation across the primary sniper schools? Instructor training, curriculum materials, range time? She'd done this math already, had it in the preliminary section of the report. 3.2 million over 3 years. The number sat on the table. Calloway said, the comparison isn't just cost. The technology package delivers a trained operator in 6 months. The manual curriculum you're describing is, 18 months minimum before a student can perform at today's demonstration level? 12 to 15, Evelyn said, if we select for aptitude correctly at the front end. That's still 2 to 3 times the training pipeline. For a capability that doesn't stop working when the battery dies, she said. And that generates operators who can use the technology package better because they understand what it's measuring, and more importantly, what it isn't measuring. Calloway looked at her. His expression had gone through several careful adjustments during the conversation and had arrived at something that was neither hostile nor friendly. The expression of a man who has decided that the meeting is not going the way he needs it to go and is beginning the internal process of deciding what the next move is. The complementary approach, he said. You're arguing for teaching both. I'm arguing for building the foundation first, she said. The manual skill set is the foundation. The technology package is a force multiplier on top of a foundation that currently doesn't exist in most of the training population. She paused. You're selling a force multiplier to people who haven't built what it's supposed to multiply. That's the curriculum gap. The room was quiet for long enough that the mountain wind outside became audible through the building's old windows, a low, steady pressure that the glass flexed slightly against. Ferris looked at Cray. I want to revisit the afternoon data, specifically the density layering correction cross made on target 5. Can you walk the committee through that calculation? Evelyn opened her notebook to the relevant page. She set it in the center of the table so the committee could see the notation, the terrain diagram, the wind measurements, the layering model she'd built from Wednesday's ground observation and Thursday morning's cross-referencing. Calloway leaned forward to look at the notebook. He looked at it for a long time. His expression was doing something that was difficult to characterize. Not defeat exactly, but the particular look of a man who is very good at his work and has just examined work that he recognizes as better than his own in a specific domain, and is still in the process of figuring out how to file that recognition. You built this yesterday, he said. Not accusatory, just confirming. Wednesday. 6 hours of terrain observation and 2 hours of cross-referencing against historical wind data from the facility's logs. The facility keeps wind logs? Training facilities at this elevation generally do, for weather window planning. She paused. The logs go back 14 years. The afternoon density layering pattern at this range has been documented 17 times in October range reports. It appears in the maintenance logs as a note about certain target positions being inconsistent in October afternoons. She closed the notebook. It's not new information. It just hasn't been translated into ballistic terms. Calloway sat back. He looked at the ceiling for a brief moment. When he looked back at the room, something in his professional composure had undergone a subtle adjustment. Not a crack, but a recalibration. The adjustment of a man who is deciding whether to keep arguing the original brief or pivot to a more defensible position. The complementary model, he said again, but it came out differently this time. Less like a question, more like a man testing the weight of something. Evelyn said nothing. If the committee recommends a combined curriculum approach, Calloway said, looking at Cray, the technology package remains in the training pipeline. The manual method becomes prerequisite instruction. The overall program is longer, but the end state capability is, he paused, working out the language in real time, more robust. Vickers looked at him. That's what she's been saying for the last 20 minutes. I'm saying it from the contractor's perspective, Calloway said, with the rueful fraction of a smile of a man who can acknowledge a corner when he's been backed into one. Which matters for the procurement conversation. Cray looked at Evelyn. Cross, are you comfortable with a combined curriculum recommendation? It depends on the sequencing language, she said. If the recommendation specifies manual first as a prerequisite rather than a parallel track, yes. If it allows programs to implement the technology track independently and add the manual component as optional enrichment, no. She was direct about it. No hedging, no diplomatic softening. The whole point of the curriculum is that the technology is less effective without the foundation. A recommendation that allows programs to skip the foundation defeats the purpose. That's a hard sell to training commands with 6-month pipelines, Cray said. I know. How do you make the case? Today's afternoon data, she said. Target 5. 3 rounds versus 1 round. In a non-evaluation context, against a threat that can move, that gap has consequences. She paused. The committee doesn't need to make the abstract case for the manual foundation. The data from today makes the concrete case. The question is whether the report reflects that clearly enough that the training commands have to answer for it if they choose to ignore it. Cray looked at Ferris. Ferris was looking at his notepad, where he had been writing with steady, consistent attention since the debrief began. He looked up. The report language matters, Ferris said. If the recommendation is a directive rather than a suggestion, the training commands have to respond to it formally. If it's a suggestion, they can table it. Who controls the recommendation language? Evelyn asked. The committee chair, Cray said. He was looking at her with the flat, measuring attention he'd first turned on her across the conference table that morning, before the first shot. Which is me. The committee wrapped at 18:30. Outside, the mountain dark had come down fast the way it does at elevation. Not a gradual dimming, but a decisive shift, the sun dropping behind the western ridge, and the temperature following it down by 15 degrees in 40 minutes. The parking area lights came on automatically and cast the kind of harsh, yellow-white light that makes everything look slightly more exhausted than it is. Evelyn was loading her truck when Calloway came out of the building. He crossed the parking area without hurrying, hands in his jacket pockets, and stopped a few feet from her vehicle with the body language of someone who has made a decision about how to conduct this conversation and is committed to it. The session logs you mentioned this morning, he said. 312 range sessions. She looked at him. I can get them to you by end of week. I don't actually need them for the evaluation record, he paused. I said that to get a number, which I got. She continued loading her equipment. 11 years, he said. That's a lot of range time for an evaluation specialist. She didn't answer. I work with a lot of military clients, Calloway said. Different commands, different programs. You develop a sense for categories of people. The evaluation specialists I meet are generally analysts, people who've done operational work but are now in the pipeline support role. Good people, important work. He paused. They don't usually shoot like that. Evelyn set the last case in the truck bed and closed the tailgate. What are you asking? She said. I'm not asking anything, he said. I'm observing. He was quiet for a moment. The mountain wind moved through the parking area, and both of them stood in it without adjusting their postures. I've been on the wrong side of this argument before. Not this specific argument, but the shape of it, where the data says one thing and the contract says another, and someone in the room has done the work well enough that the data can't be argued with. What did you do those times? He looked at the mountains. Depended on the situation. A pause. Sometimes I found a way to make the data fit the contract. Sometimes I went back to the client and told them the contract needed to change. He looked at her. The second option is less common, but it exists. Evelyn looked at him steadily. What are you going to tell your client this time? Calloway was quiet for a moment. He had the look of a man making a decision in real time, not performing the decision, but actually making it, which looked different and was different. I'm going to tell them that the combined curriculum approach creates a larger training market, not a smaller one, he said. That the manual prerequisite phase is an opportunity to extend the training relationship, not a threat to it, and that the afternoon data from today suggests the current system has a documented performance gap in mountain terrain that the development roadmap needs to address before the next contract cycle. He paused. Which is all true. And the $40 million contract restructures, he said, doesn't disappear. He picked up his bag. Your report is going to say what it says. I can't change that, and I stopped trying to change things like that a few years ago. What I can do is make sure my client is positioned to be part of the solution rather than the problem. He looked at her one more time. For what it's worth, what you did today. The terrain mapping, the density layering correction. I've watched a lot of precision shooting evaluations. He stopped. Started again. It was genuinely impressive. He walked back toward the building without waiting for a response. Evelyn watched him go. She stood in the parking area for a moment with the mountain dark pressing down and the facility lights casting their harsh angles and the wind moving cold off the ridge line. She got in the truck. Cray found her before she left. He knocked on the truck window, which was the kind of thing three-star generals do not generally do, and she rolled it down. He had a folder. He held it through the window. Committee's preliminary recommendation, he said. Directive language. Manual first prerequisite. I want you to read it tonight and tell me tomorrow morning if the sequencing language is tight enough. She took the folder, looked at the cover page. Sir, she said, the sequencing language. If it's not tight enough. I know, he said. That's why I want you to read it. She looked at the folder, then at him. How long have you been planning to use today's evaluation for this? He looked at her with the expression of a man deciding how honest to be. Whitmore told me about your evaluation role in August, he said. The technology dependency problem has been on my desk for 2 years. I've needed a vehicle that generated committee-level data rather than program-level data. He paused. Iron Horizon was your idea. Bridgeport was mine. Evelyn absorbed this. You used the Iron Horizon result to justify bringing me to Bridgeport. I used Holloway's after-action note about your Iron Horizon performance to justify the demonstrator selection. Yes. He looked at the mountains. Holloway and I have known each other for 22 years. He called me the day after Iron Horizon. She was quiet for a moment. What did he tell you? He said he watched a staff sergeant, cover rank, he knew it was cover, run a standard M2010 in Iron Horizon conditions and hit 6 for 6 on the main course, then put a borrowed 338 on a 2,000-meter plate on a 3-second wind window, and then have a conversation with him in a parking lot that made him feel like he'd been talking to someone who'd been carrying a file he wasn't authorized to open. Cray paused. He said the file was probably worth opening. Evelyn looked at the folder in her hands. My actual rank, she said, is in your file, Cray said, which I'm authorized to read. The wind moved through the parking area again. Evelyn looked at the mountains, barely visible now, as dark shapes against a darker sky. Command Sergeant Major Cross, Cray said, with the specific weight of a man putting a name to something that has been in the room without its name for the entire day. The Overwatch operation in 2019. The multinational rescue force. She was very still. 3 days behind the line, he said. 72 hours of sustained overwatch with equipment that was failing in the second 24-hour period. You improvised field repairs to the ranging system and continued the mission. He paused. The after-action report credited the successful extraction to the Overwatch element's sustained accuracy. It didn't name you specifically because the program was classified, but it named the techniques. Those techniques are in the curriculum draft, she said. I know, Cray said. I read the draft in September. He looked at her directly. They need to be in every sniper school in the special operations community within 3 years. That's what I'm going to recommend to SOCOM. He paused. The report that makes that recommendation needs to be bulletproof, which means today's data needs to be bulletproof, which means the evaluation needed a demonstrator who could actually demonstrate. Evelyn looked at the folder. That's why it was me, she said. It wasn't a question. That's why it was you. She was quiet for a long moment. The mountain dark was complete now, and the facility lights made the parking area into an island of harsh yellow in the surrounding black, and the wind came off the ridgeline with the cold, indifferent persistence of high-altitude air that doesn't register human weight. The recommendation language, she said finally. I'll have notes to you by 0600. Cray nodded once. He started to turn away, stopped. Cross, he said. The 2019 operation, the rescue force that came out. He paused. I had a friend in that column. She looked at him. His expression was completely controlled, but something behind it was not controlled, and it had been there all day. Not visible exactly, but present in the way of something too large to fully contain, carried quietly in the spaces between everything he'd said and done since she'd arrived at this facility. He made it out, Cray said, in case you were wondering if anyone ever said that to you. He walked back toward the building. His footsteps on the parking area gravel were steady and unhurried and entirely ordinary, the footsteps of a man going from one room to another, carrying nothing visible. Evelyn sat in the truck with the folder on the passenger seat and the engine not yet running and the mountain dark surrounding the island of yellow light. And she sat there for a while without starting the engine because there are moments that require sitting in rather than moving through, and this was one of them. She had learned, over 17 years, to hold both things at once, the operational fact and the human weight of it, the technique that worked and the 3 days it had taken to make it work, and the cost that 3 days of elevation with failing equipment in a denied area had extracted, not in blood, but in the quieter currency of what it takes to stay functional when everything is trying to convince you that functional is no longer an option. She had never been told directly that anyone made it out. She knew the mission result. The extraction had succeeded. She'd read the summary. She'd filed it under completed and moved to the next assignment the way you do when the next assignment is already waiting. But the operational summary doesn't tell you what Cray just told her, because the operational summary is a document, and documents don't carry the specific human weight of someone who was in the column saying he made it out, in case you were wondering. She started the engine. She drove out of the parking area, and the facility lights receded in the rearview mirror, and the mountain dark closed around the truck, and the road down from the high terrain was empty and winding and long, and she drove it the way she did everything, steadily, without hurry, reading what was ahead. Then the notes she promised Cray were done by 0430. She hadn't slept. Not because she couldn't. She'd trained herself years ago to sleep in worse conditions than a bunk in a facility guest room with a mountain wind pressing at the window, but because the folder's language needed work, and the work kept pulling her back to the desk. And somewhere around midnight, she'd accepted that the desk was where she was going to be until the document said what it needed to say. The sequencing language in Cray's preliminary draft was good but not tight enough in 3 places. The first was the prerequisite definition. The draft used the phrase foundational environmental reading instruction without specifying minimum hours or evaluation benchmarks, which left enough room for a training command to satisfy the requirement on paper with a 2-day classroom block and a multiple-choice test. She rewrote it with specific field hour minimums and a performance standard tied to the Iron Horizon-style engagement metrics she'd spent 4 months developing. 40 hours classroom, 60 hours field observation in variable terrain, demonstrated competency on a standardized terrain wind evaluation before any technology package instruction began. The second problem was the contractor language. The draft was careful, but not careful enough about establishing that the technology package evaluation criteria needed to include terrain effect performance testing going forward. The kind of testing that today's afternoon run had just demonstrated was a gap. She added 2 paragraphs that Callaway's legal team would read carefully and that she'd worded in a way that made the terrain effect testing a program requirement rather than a contractor option. It would cost him development money. She'd thought about that. She'd written the paragraphs anyway. The third problem was smaller, but in some ways the most important: the report's language around instructor qualification. The current draft said that manual curriculum instruction should be delivered by personnel with demonstrated precision shooting experience. She changed it to require instructors with documented field performance in variable terrain conditions at distances above 1,500 meters, which meant the instructor pool couldn't be filled by range officers who'd spent their careers on flat, controlled facilities. It meant finding people who'd actually done this work in the places where it mattered. She knew there weren't many. That was the problem and also the point. At 0430, she printed the annotated draft on the facility's shared printer down the hall. 6 pages of her handwriting layered over the typed original in red pencil, the margins dense with notation, and put it in a plain folder and went back to her room and lay on the bunk with her clothes on and her boots off, and was asleep in under 4 minutes. Cray knocked at 0550. She was already up. He read the annotations standing at the desk in the guest room while she made coffee on the small machine on the counter that produced something that was approximately coffee in the way that a field ration is approximately a meal. He read without speaking for 11 minutes. She drank the approximate coffee and looked out the window at the mountains going from black to gray in the pre-dawn light. "The instructor qualification language," he said finally. "Yes. That's going to be a problem for the training commands. The pool of qualified instructors is small," she said. "I know. How do you build it? You start the program anyway, and you pipeline the instructor training alongside the student training. You identify the practitioners who already have the field background and you get them into the instruction role before they rotate out of operational assignments." She paused. "The pool isn't as small as it looks. It's just dispersed. There are people in the community with this skill set who've been using it operationally for years without it being recognized as a trainable, transferable capability." She looked at him. "Hayes is one. There are others." Cray looked at the page. "Hayes is still operational. For another 18 months, maybe. He's been in the sniper cell for 6 years. He'll rotate eventually." She paused. "The curriculum needs to be ready to bring him in when he does." Cray turned to the contractor language pages. "Read them carefully." His expression shifted slightly. Not discomfort, but the specific recognition of a man who understands that certain language choices create institutional friction that will need to be managed downstream. "Callaway's team is going to push back on the terrain effect testing requirement," he said. "I know. It adds cost to the development cycle. It also closes the performance gap that the afternoon data documented," she said. "The committee can't recommend the technology package as a comprehensive solution and simultaneously ignore a documented performance gap. The terrain effect testing requirement is what makes the recommendation defensible against the next evaluation cycle." She paused. "If Callaway is smart, and he is, he'll use the requirement as leverage to get the development funding allocated earlier rather than treating it as an obstacle." Cray looked at her. "You talked to him last night." "In the parking lot, briefly." "What's his position?" "He's recalibrating." She picked up her coffee. "He's not happy, but he's professional enough to understand when the data has moved past the point where the argument is worth having." Cray closed the folder. He looked at the mountains outside the window, where the dawn light was beginning to define the ridgelines in the specific gray gold of high-altitude morning, the kind of light that makes the terrain look both simpler and more complicated than it actually is. "The 2019 operation," he said. She waited. "The technique you developed for the third day, when the ranging system failed. The manual triangulation method using terrain features as reference points," he paused. "It's in the curriculum draft. Phase 3, she said. Advanced field improvisation. It's the hardest module to teach because it requires the student to already have the terrain reading foundation solid enough to use it as a computational resource rather than just as context." She paused. "But it's teachable. It just takes time." "How much time?" "The triangulation method specifically. 4 to 6 weeks of dedicated practice in complex terrain. But you can only get to it after the foundation modules are complete, which is why the sequencing language matters." She looked at him. "If a training command shortcuts the prerequisite phase, they'll never get their students to phase 3. They'll have people who can describe the technique but can't execute it under pressure, which is worse than not teaching it at all, because it creates false confidence." Cray picked up the folder. He tucked it under his arm. I'm going to submit the recommendation with your language intact, he said. All of it, including the instructor qualification standard and the terrain effect testing requirement. He paused. It's going to create friction. I know. SOCOM training office is going to push back on the pipeline extension. Whitmore can handle SOCOM training office, Evelyn said. Something moved in Cray's expression. Not quite a smile, but its close neighbor. You have a lot of confidence in Colonel Whitmore. She took a curriculum evaluation project that nobody thought was going to produce actionable data and turned it into a committee-level evaluation with directive authority, Evelyn said. I have exactly the right amount of confidence in her. Cray moved toward the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. The recommendation is going to name you, he said, as the primary curriculum developer. Your actual designation, not the cover role. He looked at her. That means the cover assignment ends. Your rank comes off restriction. Whoever you've been for the last 4 months goes back in the file. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She'd known this was coming. The cover assignment had always had a defined endpoint, and the endpoint was the report. But knowing something is coming and standing in the moment of it are different experiences. When? She asked. When the recommendation is submitted. 3 weeks, maybe 4. He paused. How do you feel about that? She considered the question with the honest attention it deserved rather than the automatic response that would have been easier. I feel like the curriculum matters more than the designation, she said finally, and the curriculum needs the designation to carry weight with the training commands. She paused. So I feel like it's the right time. Cray nodded. He walked out. His footsteps went down the hall and she heard the exterior door open and close. And then there was just the mountain wind and the approximate coffee going cold on the counter and the folder in his hands that contained, in red pencil and plain language, the most important thing she'd written in 17 years. She called Hayes from the parking area while she loaded the truck 2 hours later with the morning sun fully up and the Sierra Nevada doing what it does when the light hits it right, making everything look like it was worth the drive. He answered on the second ring. How'd the debrief go? The recommendation is going directive, she said. Manual first prerequisite. Full sequencing language. A pause. She could hear something in this background that might have been a range or might have been outdoor machinery. The ambient noise of Hayes' life, which was always somewhere operational. Callaway? Recalibrating. She put the last case in and closed the tailgate. The report names me. Actual designation. The cover ends in 3 to 4 weeks. How do you feel about that? She looked at the mountains. You're the second person to ask me that this morning. What'd you tell the first person? That the curriculum matters more than the designation. That's a very cross answer, Hayes said. What does that mean? It means you answered the institutional question instead of the personal one. A pause. Not awkward, just the pause of a man who says what he means and takes a moment to make sure he means it. 17 years is a long time to carry something that nobody's allowed to acknowledge. The cover assignment is part of that. The 2019 operation is part of that. The range sessions that don't appear in the public record are part of that. Another pause. I'm asking how you feel about people finally knowing. She stood in the parking area with the truck running and the morning sun on the hood and the question in the air between them that was not institutional at all. Complicated, she said. Yeah, Hayes said. I figured. The work doesn't change, she said. The curriculum is the same document regardless of whose name is on it. The techniques are the same techniques. The students who learn them, they're not going to know about Iron Horizon or Bridgeport or 2019. They're just going to learn how to read the wind. That's enough, Hayes said. That's actually the whole point. She thought about that for a moment. The simplicity of it, which was not actually simple, but had the quality of something true. The thing distilled to what it actually is after everything else has been removed. The instructor role, she said, when you rotate out of the sniper cell. A pause on his end that was longer than his usual pauses. Whitmore reach out to you? He asked. Not yet. She will. How long do I have to think about it? 18 months, she said. Give or take. He was quiet for a moment. Teaching is different from doing. Yes. I'm not sure I'm good at it. You put your rifle down next to a stranger at Iron Horizon because you recognized what she was doing and you knew she needed a tool she didn't have, Evelyn said. That's teaching. That's exactly what teaching is. She paused. You're already good at it. You just haven't done it in a classroom. Hayes said nothing for a moment. She could hear the background noise on his end, the range, or the machinery, or the ordinary ambient texture of a life that was about to start making different decisions about where it went next. "Send me the curriculum draft," he said finally. "I'll send it when the recommendation clears committee." "All right." A pause. "Cross." "Yeah." "The third day," he said. 2019. Q. The ranging system. She was quiet. "I read the technical annex in the classified debrief," he said, "when it was released to the sniper cell in 2021. I didn't know it was you." The author designation was redacted, but I read the improvised triangulation method and I spent 3 months trying to replicate it in training conditions. A pause. "I couldn't fully replicate it. Not the density correction component." "The density correction requires the terrain reading foundation first," she said. "You can't reverse engineer it from the technique alone. You have to build from the ground up." "I know that now," he said. "I didn't know it in 2021. "That's why the curriculum exists," she said. Hayes was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said. "All right." And she could hear in the two words the specific quality of a man who has just closed a loop that he didn't know was open. 6 weeks later, Pierce called her. She was at Fort Bragg, in a conference room that smelled like every conference room at Fort Bragg. Old carpet and stale air and the ambient residue of 10,000 hours of planning conducted under fluorescent light. Working through the curriculum's Phase 2 module with 2 instructional designers who were very good at their jobs and who kept wanting to add multimedia components that Evelyn kept explaining would not work in the field environments where the training actually needed to function. Her phone showed Pierce's number and she almost didn't answer. Not because she was avoiding him, but because the instructional design meeting was at a critical point, and because she genuinely hadn't thought about Pierce in 6 weeks, which was its own kind of resolution. She answered anyway, some instinct about completion. "Sergeant Cross," he said. And then, after a pause, "I heard your command, Sergeant Major Cross. I've been using the wrong form of address." "It's fine," she said. "It's not, actually." His voice had something in it that wasn't quite apology but was in the same family. The voice of a man who has been working on something for 6 weeks and has arrived at the version of it he can actually say out loud. "I was out of line at Iron Horizon, the parking lot, the range, all of it." She waited. Not to make him earn it, she wasn't interested in making him earn it, but because she could tell he wasn't finished. "I've been thinking about the wind," he said, "the canyon. I've been running the numbers on what you did with the thermal pattern, and I can't fully replicate your read. I can get to the firing position data clean, I can get to the standard terrain corrections, but the timing element, the way you identified the 3-second window and knew when the cycle would hold, I can't reverse engineer that from watching it happen." "You can't reverse engineer it," she said. "You have to build it." "I know. That's why I'm calling." A pause. "I heard there's a curriculum in development, manual environmental reading, phase-based instruction." She looked at the 2 instructional designers across the table, who were politely studying their laptops. "There is," she said. "Is there a way to get into the pilot program?" he said. "When it runs." She was quiet for a moment, not because the answer was complicated, but because she was taking the actual weight of what he was asking, which was not really about the program. It was about the conversation he'd been having with himself for 6 weeks since the desert, which was a harder conversation than most men his age and rank were willing to have. And the fact that he'd gotten to the end of it and made this call was something she found she could respect without making a ceremony of respecting it. "I'll put your name on the pilot list," she said. "It's not my call alone, but I'll put the name on it." "That's all I'm asking," Pierce said. She told him she had to get back to the meeting. He said he understood. Neither of them made it into anything more than what it was, which was the right way to handle it. She put the phone down. The instructional designers were looking at her. "Where were we?" she said, and picked up her pencil. "Well, the curriculum pilot ran in February at a training facility in western Montana that Evelyn had selected specifically for its terrain, the kind of complex variable condition mountain geography that put genuine pressure on environmental reading skills and that couldn't be faked by a good performance in controlled conditions. 12 students, 8 weeks. The temperature during the first week reached -9 degrees Fahrenheit, which was not planned but was not unwelcome. Because cold is one of the things that separates what you can do from what you can only do when conditions cooperate. Hayes was there as a co-instructor. He'd gotten the call from Whitmore in December, 2 weeks after his rotation out of the sniper cell was confirmed, and he'd called Evelyn that evening and said, "I'm in," which was all either of them needed. He was good at it. Not perfect. Nobody is perfect at teaching in the first weeks of doing it, and Hayes had the specific struggle of a practitioner who has done something so long and so deeply that making its components explicit for a student required a kind of deliberate excavation that didn't come naturally. But he was honest about the struggle, which made him better at the job than most people who struggled less. Students could see him working through the explanation in real time, and the working through was itself instructional. It showed them what it looked like to actually think about something rather than perform competence. Pierce was in the pilot cohort. He arrived in Montana with his expensive custom rifle and his expensive custom case and his dope book, and he set them up on his assigned shooting position on the first morning with the same organized efficiency he'd always had. Evelyn watched him set up from the far end of the line. He planted his own wind indicator thread before she asked the students to. She noted it, said nothing. The 8 weeks had their failures. 2 students washed out of Phase 1, not because they lacked aptitude, but because the Phase 1 standard was real, and the real standard meant that falling short of it was informative rather than punitive. They'd re-enter the next pilot with additional preparation. The curriculum had space for that. Evelyn had written it with space for that. On the final evaluation day, in late March, with the Montana winter breaking into the tentative, muddy beginning of a spring that hadn't quite committed, the 12 remaining students ran the full Phase 1 and Phase 2 sequence against the facility's range system. Variable conditions. No electronic assistance. Notebook, wind indicator, terrain reading skills built over 8 weeks of daily, structured practice in conditions that didn't care about their feelings. 9 of 12 passed the performance standard. In the debrief, Evelyn sat at the front of the room and watched the students process the results. The 9 who'd passed doing the quiet, internal version of satisfaction that doesn't perform itself, and the 3 who hadn't doing the harder work of understanding where the gap still was. She gave the 3 specific technical feedback that identified exactly which component of the Phase 2 skill set needed more time, because generic encouragement wasn't useful to them, and they deserved the truth about what the next 8 weeks of work needed to look like. Hayes handled the closeout brief. She watched him stand at the front of the room and talk to 12 soldiers, most of them young, some of them combat veterans who'd arrived with the specific wariness of people who've been through enough training cycles to be skeptical of the next one. And she watched the room listen to him with the particular quality of attention that people give to someone who has earned the right to be believed. He didn't make it a speech. He made it a conversation. He talked about what the skill was for, not as an abstraction, but in the specific, grounded terms of someone who had used it in places that mattered and knew what the difference felt like between having it and not having it. He talked about the 3 students who hadn't passed with the same directness he gave the 9 who had, because the 3 needed the directness more, and he wasn't willing to shortchange them for the comfort of the room. And at the end, almost as an aside, he said, "The person who developed this curriculum spent 3 days at elevation in a denied area with a failing ranging system and kept the mission alive using exactly what you've been learning for the last 8 weeks. She didn't develop this curriculum to teach you a technique. She developed it to give you what she had when the equipment stopped working and the target was still there, and the only thing left was whether you'd built the skill or whether you'd only built the habit of relying on something else." He paused. "Build the skill. Everything else is support." The room was quiet. Evelyn was looking at her notebook. She had the mechanical pencil in her hand, but she wasn't writing. Pierce was in the 3rd row. I was looking at his own notebook, which had 6 weeks of field observations in it that he'd made with a standard pencil, his handwriting smaller and more careful than it used to be, pressed hard enough into the page that the impressions would still be there years from now when the ink had faded. He didn't look at Evelyn. He didn't need to. The notebook was the acknowledgement, and the acknowledgement was enough. The curriculum was formally adopted by SOCOM Training Office in June. The document that made it official was 17 pages of institutional language that contained, somewhere in the middle of its technical appendix, a performance standard derived from a 6-hour terrain observation session at a Sierra Nevada facility on a cold October afternoon, a standard built from the specific, painstaking, unglamorous work of a woman who had spent 17 years developing a skill that nobody had thought to write down, in places nobody had thought to acknowledge, for reasons that most people with the authority to notice had not yet understood were worth noticing. The implementation rolled out across 3 sniper schools in the first year, 47 instructors trained, 212 students through the Phase 1 and 2 sequence. The failure and retest rate in the first cycle was higher than the program's critics had predicted and lower than its designers had feared, which meant it was about where it needed to be. Hard enough to mean something, achievable enough to mean something different. Hayes ran the Montana facility through a second and third cohort. He got better at the teaching with each cycle, the excavation of the implicit becoming more fluent, the translation between what he knew in his hands and what the students needed in their heads becoming more natural. He never stopped being a practitioner. He just became also a teacher, which is a different kind of mastery and not a lesser one. Evelyn finished the report. Then she started the next one because there was a Phase 3 curriculum that still existed only in her notebook and in the classified technical annex of the 2019 debrief, and Phase 3 needed to exist somewhere that future soldiers could reach it. She worked on it at the same temporary desk in the same borrowed office at Fort Huachuca, with the same mechanical pencil sharpened to the same fine point, and the same notebook, a new one now, the original filled and filed, open beside the laptop. The window still looked at a wall. The desk still had 4 different sets of scratches from 4 different previous occupants. She was adding a 5th. The canyon diagram from Iron Horizon was still on the wall. She'd moved it from facility to facility through the intervening months, smoothing the tape and re-adhering it each time, because it was the beginning of the thing, and the beginning mattered even when you were well past it, maybe especially then. She looked at it sometimes when the writing was difficult, when the language for what she knew wouldn't come out in the form that an institutional document required, when the gap between the knowledge in her hands and the words on the page felt too wide to bridge. She looked at the 7 target positions marked in pencil, at the wind arrows, at the notation for the 3-second window, circled twice. 1 shot, 2,240 meters. 3 seconds between what the wind would do and what it would do next. The gap is always bridgeable. You just have to build what you need to cross it before you need to cross it. Not in the moment, not under pressure, not when everything else is already failing. Before, in the cold, in the dark, in the borrowed office with the approximate coffee, in the terrain that doesn't care whether you understand it yet. You build the skill. Everything else is support. And sometimes, in the right moment, a stranger puts the right tool beside you and steps back, and the rest is yours. The breath, the read, the press of the trigger, and the long silence before the steel rings back across the distance you were told was too far to reach. It was never too far. It just required someone willing to do the work before anyone was watching. To everyone who has ever been underestimated, dismissed, or told the distance is too great, the skill you build in the silence before the audience arrives is the only thing that ever truly speaks for you. Build it anyway. Build it when no one is watching, because the moment will come, and when it does, it won't ask whether you were ready. It will only ask whether you built the thing or whether you only wished you had.